There's no question that Cosmo is a very, very good dog. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 32nd film in the MCU, Marvel's 2023 superhero sci-fi sequel, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 stars Chris Pratt, Zoe Saldana, and Karen Gillan, and was directed by James Gunn. It continues the story of the Guardians of the Galaxy as they set out on a mission to save the life of one of their own. 9 years after the release of the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie, it's interesting to look back and see just how huge of a gamble it was for the MCU. This was a franchise that had built itself around the Avengers, and around well-known, well-established characters that even non-comic book fans could recognize. Iron Man, Captain America, the Hulk, Thor, everybody already knew these characters to some extent, so it wasn't that crazy to make movies about them. But after several sequels involving those core four, Marvel decided to expand the MCU. And rather than giving us a solo movie for a character we'd already been introduced to, like Black Widow or Hawkeye, or even a film for a well-established but new to the MCU character like Spider-Man, they gave us the Guardians of the Galaxy. This was a group that was a tad bit obscure even to comic book readers, and a brand new wild departure from the already established expectations of the MCU. It boasted a vastly different tone, a slew of new characters, and forced us headlong into the oddity of cosmic Marvel. If Guardians of the Galaxy wasn't well received by audiences, it could have very easily killed the MCU. But luckily, it was well received, not only resulting in several more Guardians outings, but also preparing audiences for whatever the MCU would throw at them next. Even though it's been less than a decade since their MCU introduction, the Guardians of the Galaxy have embedded themselves deeply into the fabric of the MCU. With 3 solo films, a holiday special, and integral involvement in other MCU movies like Avengers Infinity War and Endgame, the Guardians have spanned 4 phases of the MCU, and have become just as well known and beloved as those original core 4 Avengers that kicked off the franchise. And it's that audience attachment that's been able to make this trilogy what it is. The Guardians of the Galaxy movies stand out from other MCU films, thanks to the tone, music, and generally comedic style. But each of the 3 Guardians films are quite different. The first movie served as the origin story for the team, providing us with a fun space adventure while introducing us to all the characters. Volume 2 focused on the already established team to highlight their issues with one another on a much more personal character study level, while still maintaining an overarching cosmic threat. Volume 3 keeps things at that personal level, but tones down the humor some to focus on a darker race against the clock. Unlike the 2 previous films, this movie doesn't feature some huge galaxy-ending threat, but with its much more personal nature, its threat could still be galaxy-ending for the Guardians, making it the most emotional and compelling story of the trilogy. As with the other Guardians of the Galaxy movies, it's the characters that truly make this film what it is. It would be easy to call this a rocket movie, and although the story is quite rocket-centric and provides us with a lot of background for the character, calling it a rocket movie would be a bit of a mischaracterization, because this is very much a team story, a family story. This group has grown and developed a lot since we last saw them in a solo Guardians of the Galaxy movie. They've experienced the events of Endgame, and that had a definite and noticeable impact on their characterizations here. Everybody's got a bit of a hardened edge to them now. There's still some fun and humor between them, but the carefree goofiness is gone. Quill is still reeling from the loss of their timeline's Gamora, Mantis has grown into being her own independent character, and Nebula has become one of the most driven, family-championing members of the team, which is quite a satisfying arc for her. There's emotional character growth all around for our already loved members of the team, but we've also got some great new additions too. Cosmo the space dog had made small cameo appearances in the previous films, but she takes on the role of minor character here and is one of my favorites. A few other new animal additions are also very good, even though they're all too briefly featured in the film. On the antagonistic side of things, Volume 3 follows suit with its predecessors and features a number of villains. The primary villain of the story is the High Evolutionary, who's a pretty interesting and sinister character. He fulfills the role of mad scientist here, but he's one of those characters who's interesting because he isn't just evil for evil's sake. Don't get me wrong, he's not a sympathy-generating character, nor does he have any redeeming qualities. But in his single-mindedness, he truly believes in what he's doing. We as the audience, and the Guardians, see the cruelty and absurd evilness of his experimentation and plans, but he really believes that he's doing this for the good of life and civilization, which makes for an interesting villain. Aisha and the Sovereign People are back as minor antagonists, this time fronted by Adam Warlock, who essentially acts as a henchman for the High Evolutionary. Now, this is a character who's been teased in post-credit scenes for a long time, and he's okay, but he feels unnecessary and a bit out of place. His actions certainly catalyze the events of the film, but other than that, he kind of just pops up randomly, either as a fight-causing roadblock or as comic relief. And normally, that would work in a Guardians movie, but because of the more serious tone of this film, he ends up feeling like a goofy outlier, and it's clear that he was kind of shoehorned into the story as setup for future appearances. The Guardians of the Galaxy movies have always been a little deceptive. With their jokey, comedy-forward approach, soundtrack-driven stories, and colorful CG-heavy visuals, they're easy to mistakenly lump together with other superhero movies made purely for spectacle and entertainment. But beneath the fun exterior, these films have always tackled more heartfelt topics, usually revolving around friendship and found family. And that common theme pops up here in Volume 3 as well. When facing the more personal threat at the heart of the story, the Guardians come to realize just how much they mean to each other, and the extreme lengths that they would go for one another. It's a story that looks at pain and trauma and loss, and shows the growth that can come from it. It explores the importance of understanding and accepting your past in order to move forward and grow beyond what you already know. Thematically, this is all in line with the previous two films, but completes an arc, not just for the individual characters, but for the team as a whole. Much like the other Guardians of the Galaxy movies, Volume 3 has a very strong soundtrack. But unlike Awesome Mixes 1 and 2, Awesome Mix Volume 3 has gone digital. Rather than being mixtapes made in the 80s, the soundtrack comes from a Zune, and as such pulls from a much wider set of years. Rather than being exclusively 60s and 70s music, we get songs ranging from the 70s through the 2000s here. This wider time frame results in fewer deep cuts than past films, but we still get an assortment of songs and genres. Heart, Radiohead, Space Hog, the Beastie Boys, the Replacements, a different vibe from the 70s-centric music of the last two movies, but still good nonetheless. Although Volume 3 maintains the foundational elements of what makes a Guardians of the Galaxy movie, it certainly takes a darker, more violent approach. It's still quite funny, with a number of running gags and some really great moments, but it's the most serious Guardians movie we've had. It may not be as carefree and exuberantly fun as its predecessors, but it still works exceptionally well as the bookend to this trilogy, because much like Faith No More, we care a lot about these characters. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number 1 is the emotion. Even though I think most of us view the Guardians of the Galaxy films as fun comedies first and foremost, each of these films has possessed much more heartfelt themes and storylines than expected, and Volume 3 is no different. This film continues to expand on the friendship and found family themes of its predecessors, digging even deeper into the bonds and backstories of these characters. There's some truly heart-wrenching stuff in this movie. Quill coming to terms with the loss of his Gamora, Rocket accepting moments from his past that shaped who he became, even Nebula realizing just how much she cares about all of her teammates. There were several points in this film where people in my screening were crying, loud enough to hear them over the movie. And that's partly because of the good story, but mostly because, at this point, we've grown to really care about these characters, and so the emotion hits even harder than it has in the past, somehow being both sad and hopeful at the same time. The second pro is the story. Each of the Guardians films have tackled a different point in the team's existence. Their origins, their transition from team to family, and now their desperate attempts to remain as a complete team. So I'm a sucker for origin stories, and usually find it difficult to top them with sequels, but I think Volume 3's story might just be the best of the trilogy. This is the 32nd MCU movie, and when you take into account non-MCU Marvel films plus DC movies over the last several decades, we're talking about a lot of superhero films. And when you've seen most, if not all of them, there are certain things that start to get repetitive and less interesting after a while. For me, especially as of the last 10 years or so, that less interesting thing has been the massive scale of villain threats. There have been exceptions, but most recent comic book movies have focused on world, galaxy, or universe-altering threats. The stakes are always so ridiculously ramped up that you can't even connect with them anymore. But this third Guardians movie takes it back a bit. The High Evolutionary's plans are comparatively pretty small. He does some horrible things, but he's not hell-bent on taking over the universe or destroying all life. The threat he poses to the Guardians is much more personal. He's interested in destroying one life, and that scaled-down nature of the threat makes the story much more compelling and easy to connect with. Pro number 3 is a holdover from the previous two movies: the music. The soundtrack has been not only a source of entertainment, but also a means of storytelling for each of the Guardians films, and that continues here. Since the in-movie source of the music is a Zune, rather than cassettes, as had been previously the case, we get treated to a temporal expansion. Rather than the songs being restricted to 70s and some late 60s tunes, the soundtrack spans several decades, ranging from the 70s to the 2000s. This means that we primarily get fairly well-known songs across the board, but the expansion works for the story. As usual, the soundtrack is full of popular bands like Radiohead, the Beastie Boys, and Florence and the Machine, plus personal favorites of mine, including Heart and especially The Replacements. I Will Dare only makes it in as an end credit song, but it's tied with Take Me Down to the Hospital as my favorite Matt song, and was definitely not one I expected to hear in a modern movie. On the con side, my only real issue was Adam Warlock. And I say issue because I'm putting him in the cons, but I didn't really find him to be a huge problem. He was just a weak point. This is a character who's been teased and built up for quite some time now, and he was kind of just there in the movie. His actions kick off the story, so he does have some basic purpose here, but other than that, he kind of feels unnecessary or underused at best. He's kind of just this super powerful roadblock that shows up every now and then, so a cool fight can happen. He does have some funny moments, and is primarily played as comic relief, but he feels like the type of character that would have fit in better with the jokier Volume 2 than the slightly more serious tone movie. Instead, he feels like he's just stuck in here to get him into the MCU for future movies. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 or any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 4 out of 5 paws. This is a satisfying and emotional close to the Guardians trilogy. It's a bit darker and more serious than its predecessors, but Volume 3 doubles down on the heart and action to give us a music-filled quest that's much more personal to the team this time around. I would recommend Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 to people who like the Guardians of the Galaxy and want a good character-based story. This uses our existing attachment to these characters to deliver a story that's smaller in scale, but much more emotional than even what's come before. It incorporates plot elements that have occurred since the last Guardians of the Galaxy movie, so it's important that you've seen Avengers Infinity War and Endgame to fully understand it, but if you care about these characters and this team, this movie will have a lot to offer, even beyond the expected jokes and great music. If you liked Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, I would recommend The Plague Dogs. It's certainly not a fun or particularly uplifting movie, but this animated film from the creators of Watership Down tells the emotional tale of a pair of dogs who escape from an animal research facility. If you thought the High Evolutionary and his work on Counter-Earth was interesting, you might want to check out the 1977 version of The Island of Dr. Moreau. The 1996 version or the 1932 Island of Lost Souls would work too, but the 70s vibe fits with the tone a little better, not to mention the look of the creatures. And if you really liked the characters, you should watch or rewatch the first Guardians of the Galaxy. It serves as our introduction to this team and these characters, but also as a comparative starting point to see just how far they've come on their character arcs. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that relies on flashbacks to tell its story? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies. The way life should be.